What if the greatest conqueror of modern history humiliated, exiled, and discarded refused to accept defeat? In 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-made emperor who had rewritten Europe's destiny with fire and steel, was cast away to a tiny island in the Mediterranean. To kings and emperors, he was finished, a ghost of a fallen tyrant. But they forgot one thing. Napoleon was not a man built for silence. In exile, he watched as Europe crumbled into confusion, as the monarchy he was forced to surrender to fumbled power, and as the people of France, once fed on glory, grew restless under a crown they never chose. Then, like a thunderbolt in the calm, he escaped. With no army, no nation, and no promise of victory, Napoleon embarked on a journey unlike any before a 20-day march that would see him reclaim his empire without firing a single shot. Kings panicked. Borders bristled. The world held its breath. What followed was the 100 Days, a breathtaking saga of strategy, charisma, betrayal, and war, culminating in one of the most legendary battles in all of history, Waterloo. This is not just the story of a comeback, but it is the tale of a man who defied fate, a master of war who rolled the dice one last time against the powers of Europe, knowing full well he might lose everything. Why did he return? And what does his final gamble reveal about greatness, ambition, and the price of glory? Let's find out. The year was 1814. Napoleon Bonaparte, once feared from Cairo to Moscow, had been broken. After years of reshaping Europe through blood and brilliance, the Emperor of the French was defeated by a coalition of monarchs who had once trembled at the sound of his name. His once mighty Grande Armée lay shattered, and Paris had fallen. Now, stripped of his empire, abandoned by allies, and betrayed by his own marshals, Napoleon faced a fate worse than death for a man of his ambition: irrelevance. The Allied powers, fearing his influence, but wary of creating a martyr, chose an unusual punishment: exile to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. Barely 12 kilometers long, Elba was no match for the throne of Europe. Yet Napoleon was given sovereignty over the island, a modest income, and a small personal army. It seemed almost absurd, the master of Europe reduced to the mayor of a rock. But what the monarchs didn't understand was that Napoleon's mind was his greatest weapon. He didn't spend his days in despair. Instead, he immersed himself in the island's affairs, reorganizing agriculture, improving infrastructure, building roads, and even writing new laws. To outsiders, he seemed at peace. But inside, the lion paced in his cage, watching the world beyond the sea. He heard whispers. The French monarchy was failing. The people missed the glory days. The army was restless. And the kings who thought him caged had begun to lower their guard. What they didn't know was that Napoleon was planning. He was wounded, but not broken. Forgotten, but not gone dot, and soon the world would hear his roar again. February 26, 1815. The sea was calm, but tension crackled in the air. In the dead of night, a small flotilla slipped silently out of Portoferraio, Elba's main harbor. Aboard one of the ships stood a figure cloaked in shadows: Napoleon Bonaparte, no longer content to be an emperor without an empire. The plan was madness. With fewer than 1,200 men, veterans of past glories, he would invade France, march on Paris, and reclaim his throne. No nation, no guarantees. Only the sharp edge of destiny and the faith of those who still believed in him. As his ships crept along the coast of Italy and into the open sea, British and French patrols prowled the waters. One sighting would mean capture and likely execution. But fate or fortune was with him. They slipped through unnoticed. On March 1st, he landed near Gulf Juan, on the southern coast of France. He had no declaration of war, no flags, no cannons, just a message: Napoleon has returned. France braced for civil war. Royalist troops were immediately sent to intercept him. The world expected a swift and bloody end to his adventure. But what happened next became legend. Near Grenoble, Napoleon stood in the road as the king's soldiers confronted him. Clad in his old gray coat, he stepped forward, opened his arms, and bared his chest. "If there is one among you who would kill his emperor," he cried, "here I am." Silence. Then the cry rang out, "Vive l'Empereur!" The men dropped their weapons and joined him. With every town he passed, more soldiers rallied to his side. Entire regiments defected. Banners bearing the golden bees of the empire reappeared overnight. Not a single shot was fired. By the time Napoleon reached Lyon, he was leading an army once more. King Louis XVIII fled Paris in a panic, and on March 20th, Napoleon walked back into the Tuileries Palace, triumphant, just as he had 15 years earlier. The impossible had happened. The emperor was back. But even as the people cheered and old loyalties were reignited, Napoleon knew this victory was only the beginning. Europe was watching, and it would strike back. The news hit like a cannon blast. When word reached Vienna that Napoleon had escaped Elba and was marching toward Paris, the monarchs and diplomats attending the Congress of Vienna were stunned into silence. The ink was barely dry on the treaties redrawing Europe after years of Napoleonic war. The crowned heads of Europe, kings, emperors, Tsars, had gathered in opulent halls to divide the spoils of Napoleon's defeat, confident he was forever neutralized. Now, that very man was on the loose reclaiming France without firing a single bullet. The reaction was immediate and furious. No more diplomacy. No more delicate reshaping of borders. It was war. In a rare moment of unity, old rivals closed ranks. The great powers Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed the Seventh Coalition, vowing to crush Napoleon once and for all. Their armies were already massive, seasoned, and battle-hardened. Combined, they could field over 1 million soldiers. Napoleon, in contrast, had a fractured nation and a military still reeling from previous defeats. But his presence electrified France. His charisma reawakened a nation starved for purpose. To Europe's monarchs, this wasn't just a rebellion. It was a virus, a contagious idea. If one man could return from exile and reclaim power through sheer will, what would stop others? They feared not just Napoleon's sword, but his symbolism. He was the ghost they had tried to bury. And now he was resurrected. As armies mobilized, one thing was certain. This would not be a long game of diplomacy. This would be a swift, decisive, and brutal showdown. The world held its breath, for once again, the thunder of war echoed across Europe. By June 1815, Napoleon's empire was no longer just a dream. It was a fragile reality hanging by a thread. He had returned to power in a blaze of glory, but now Europe's wrath was marching toward him from all sides. 4 colossal armies were converging. The British, led by the calm and calculating Duke of Wellington's Prussians, under the fierce and relentless Field Marshal Blucher, and soon the Austrians and Russians sweeping in from the east like a gathering storm. If Napoleon waited, they would crush him. So he made a bold decision: strike first. His target? Belgium. There, Wellington and Blucher's armies lay dangerously close, but still apart. If Napoleon could strike fast, divide them, and destroy each army before they united, he could buy time, perhaps, even negotiate peace from a position of strength. It was a race against the clock and against fate itself. On June 15th, he crossed the border and unleashed his forces with astonishing speed. On June 16th, he met Blucher at Ligny and defeated the Prussians, driving them back. Victory? Yes, but incomplete. Blucher's army, though battered, was not broken. And unknown to Napoleon, it was regrouping. Meanwhile, Marshal Ney, tasked with holding back Wellington, fumbled at Cotter Brass, allowing the British to fall back to a strong defensive position near a small Belgian village, Waterloo. By the morning of June 18th, the battlefield was soaked in rain and anticipation. Mud swallowed boots. Cannons sank into the earth. But there was no turning back. Napoleon had 73,000 men. Wellington had about 68,000, but lurking just over the horizon. Blucher was coming back. As the battle began, Napoleon believed he could still win. His cannon thundered, cavalry charged, and wave after wave of French infantry battered Wellington's lines. But the British held gripping the ridgeline like a cliff resisting a storm. Napoleon launched his elite Imperial Guard in a final push, his last unbreakable force. And then the Prussians arrived. Flanking his army, they surged onto the battlefield just as the French were faltering. Panic spread. Lines broke. The Imperial Guard, who had never retreated, crumbled. By nightfall, the field was covered with the dead and dying. Waterloo was not just a defeat, it was a death knell. Napoleon's dream, his empire, his final bet, lay in the mud of Belgium. The eagle had fallen. Waterloo had shattered more than Napoleon's army. It had shattered his last hope. As his men fled in chaos, and the Prussians hunted down survivors with ruthless precision, Napoleon mounted his horse and rode through the wreckage, not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. For the first time in his life, he had no plan. He returned to Paris, cloaked in silence and shame. The euphoria of his return just months before had vanished. The government, sensing the winds of defeat, turned cold. His allies wavered. His people hesitated. Even his most loyal generals no longer believed a second miracle was possible. Napoleon offered to abdicate in favor of his son Napoleon II, a boy still living in Austria. But the Allies had no interest in dynasties born of revolution. They wanted him, the man himself, gone forever. On June 22, 1815, less than 100 days after his triumphant return, Napoleon abdicated for the second and final time. France was finished with him, and Europe would make sure he never returned again. He fled south, hoping to escape to America, where a new life might await far from European thrones. He lingered along the coast, dodging capture, his enemies closing in like hounds. Then, in a final act of desperation and perhaps dignity, he boarded the British warship HMS Bellerophon and surrendered to the very nation that had been his most implacable enemy. "I come, like Themistocles," he told the captain, "to throw myself upon the mercy of the British people." But mercy was not what awaited him. Britain had learned from Elba. This time, there would be no escape, no empire, no audience. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a wind-lashed volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic, 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent. A speck of rock surrounded by endless sea. There, stripped of power, influence, and freedom, he would live out his final years under constant guard, not as an emperor, but as a prisoner of history. The man who once commanded all of Europe now had one last battlefield, time itself. The 100 days lasted just over 3 months, but their impact? It rippled through centuries. Napoleon's dramatic return from exile was not just a political upheaval. It was a defiance of fate, a moment when a single man dared to stand against the collective might of all Europe, and for a brief, burning moment, almost won. The kings and emperors of Europe had celebrated his defeat in 1814. They had toasted to peace, crowned new rulers, and redrawn the map of the continent in candlelit halls. But with a single step off Elba's shores, Napoleon shattered that illusion. He proved a terrifying truth, that one man's charisma, vision, and willpower could ignite a nation and shake empires, even with no army, no allies, and no throne. His return forced monarchs to act quickly, abandoning diplomacy for gunpowder. The Battle of Waterloo, the result of their panic and his ambition, became one of the most studied, debated, and mythologized battles in history. It marked not just the end of Napoleon's rule, but the symbolic collapse of the revolutionary era he represented. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon shaped the future. In his forced exile in St. Helena, he dictated volumes of memoirs. With every word, he crafted a legacy, not as a tyrant or warmonger, but as a reformer, a modernizer, even a martyr. He portrayed himself as the enemy of kings, the voice of merit, and the man who brought order to chaos. And history, complex and contradictory, often listened. His 100 Days exposed the fragility of monarchies, the power of the masses, and the enduring magnetism of personal glory. The myth of Napoleon only grew larger in death. His ideas about law, governance, nationalism, and military organization lived on. France buried his body in 1821. But his legend never slept. Was he a genius or a madman? A liberator or a dictator? A hero or a warning? That question still haunts historians and captivates the world. Because in just 100 days, Napoleon proved something terrifyingly eternal, that history doesn't always march to the will of nations. Sometimes it rides behind one man on horseback. In just 100 days, a man who had been exiled, disgraced, and erased from the map of power returned to the world stage and nearly changed history again. Napoleon's final gamble wasn't just a military campaign, it was a test of destiny itself. With no empire and no guarantees, he dared to believe that the power of his name, his vision, and his presence could bend the world once more to his will. And for a moment, it almost did. But what if he had won at Waterloo? What if Blucher had never arrived? Would Europe today look entirely different? Would the age of monarchies have crumbled under the weight of one man's ambition? Or was his fall inevitable, a lesson that even the greatest among us cannot escape the pull of history's tide? These are the questions Napoleon left behind, lingering like echoes in the mist of the battlefield. Now, we ask you, was he a visionary or a villain, a symbol of hope, or of hubris? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight helps keep history alive and debated. And if this journey through the final days of an empire stirred your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a tale where the past dares to defy expectations. Here at Tales Beyond Time, we uncover the moments when history nearly took a different path and the people who tried to walk it. Until next time, remember, history doesn't whisper, it roars.